Yeah. By the middle of the 17th century, by the middle of the 17th century, well, and by the middle of the 17th century, you have at least, I would say, maybe 3/4 of the black population, or at least half, anyhow, being born here in America. That cuts them off from Africa. That cuts them off from a lot of the heritage that their grandparents, their parents, grandparents knew. It makes it so that these new slaves have been socialized into a system of enslavement, so that freedom isn't a memory to them anymore. By the time you get to the 1750s, most planners are a little apprehensive about having too many Africans, because they think that Africans are a bad influence on African Americans. They prefer to have, planners prefer to have slaves who can speak the language. Here was a population that they thought was a lot more malleable, a lot more manageable. For the African and for the African American, however, this meant that they had no association, or, I mean, they knew what freedom meant because they could see white people around them every day being free. But as far as African culture and African survivals, African life, this was something that they heard through their parents and grandparents, and increasingly as generation passed and generation passed, African culture would become something that wasn't really real to them, and they would become a lot more American in their thinking. But becoming a lot more American meant being brought up as a slave and having only slavery as a frame of reference, whereas before that you had culture, you had lineage, you have compounds, you have people who speak a totally different language, and you just have a totally different culture. Well, the birth of a child is a source of joy, because it gives the mother, gives the father an identity apart from that of being a slave. It allows them to say, this is my child, I am a father, I am a mother. It gives them responsibilities that go beyond just doing somebody else's labor. For women, when a woman could look at her child and say, this child, him, is mine, this is something that came from her, and something that the planner might take away from, which is the other part of it. This is the most sorrowful part, but something that most women, it gave them a meaning and an existence that was apart from that meaning and existence that was attached to enslavement. It's hard being a parent under slavery. Women, men, mothers and fathers tried to be mothers and fathers, so they wanted their children to obey them. If I say something, you listen to me. But they also know that the master is the ultimate authority. And if a master says something, there's a great story of a kid who's called by his father and a slave master both at the same time. And the child turns towards a slave master. And when he gets back to his father smacks him and says, when I call you, you come. You're my child. But imagine the dilemma. Imagine the dilemma of the child. He has seen his mother and father whipped. He has seen just horrendous things, horrific things that go on the plantation. He knows who has the authority. He sees the parents, even though parents try to feed their children by providing, men by hunting and fishing, and women and men by growing things in a garden. Rations are given out by slave masters. Food, clothing, the authority is the slave master, and children got very mixed signals. But ultimately, I think the signal that they get is that the person who was ultimately in control was the slave master. And yet I still think that parents were able to impart a sense of individuality to a child. And I think one of the ways they did this was by telling them stories. So you have wonderful stories being told about for instance, the Brer Rabbit story, where the tar baby gets stuck, and when when the wolf comes through and wants to eat the rabbit in very cunning and very sly way says, but if you can burn me, and I think I'd love to be burned, but please throw me in the briar patch, because that would be a fate worse than death. And of course, when the rabbit gets thrown into the briar patch, he can work his way loose. But what the story taught, and what parents really wanted to impart by telling this kind of story, is that even though master might have all of the power, it might be large and have at his command every kind of wickedness that he could possibly have, by use of cunning, by use of wit, by use of smarts, that the slave or the poor rabbit, the smaller being, could in fact prevail. Well, they were in fact living in a state of war. Mistresses and masters could never really tell what their slaves, in particular the slave women who worked in the house, what they were thinking. They had to be concerned, and in fact we know that they were concerned. You see newspaper articles. For instance, there's a newspaper article in the South Carolina Gazette in 1755 that informs the readers that a slave family, a whole entire slave family, was poisoned by the woman who was serving them food. So they really can never tell what the slave woman is thinking, what her perceptions are. And so they have to imagine it. And in their imaginations, they turn the women who work for them into passive beings, into loving beings. But in fact, the cases of poison, the cases of murder, belie the fact that these women were satisfied and were passive. Well, lots of times, mistresses, lots of times women would take things to eat for their families, and they would steal food, and the mistress would get wind of it. And the problem was, lots of times mistresses were afraid to whip. In fact, they usually left the whipping to masters. But women in the house were always at each other's necks, throats. There was always a test of wills. There's a great story about a slave named Alcee. And Alcee wanted to be put in the fields. She was tired of working around the whites, and she kept requesting it, and nothing came of her request. And finally, she decides that she's going to cook a hen. And this hen Alcee wanted to be put in the fields because she was tired of always being at the beck and call of a white family. And nothing came of her request. And she kept asking, and nothing came of it. So finally, she decided, well, I'll make sure that they put me in the fields. And so she cooks up a dead hen and serves it up for dinner. The hen had been dead for a couple of days, and she served it and with all of the fixings. And next day, she was sent to the field. She wasn't reprimanded. She was just sent to the field. She got her way. There were other incidents where women feigned illness. If they thought that the master or mistress had overstepped their bounds, had asked them to do too much many times, and they would feign illness. And women in particular could get away with feigning illness a little bit more than men. I mean, without stretching the point or without exaggerating, slaves were there to work, and very few masters and mistresses let people just not work. But women were expected to reproduce the slave population. They had the children, so they could use their menstrual cycle. They could use pains associated with it. They could use real pains associated with childbirth to say, look, this is enough. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it wasn't real, but they often feigned illness to get out of work. Very often the point at which black children and white children separated was when the white children went off to school, when it was time for them to learn to read and write. And it was time for the black children to go into the fields. And up until that time, quite frequently, they had been playing with each other, particularly if you're in an isolated area and the white children had no other children to play with but the slave. But I think what happens at that particular point is the white child then begins to understand not only what it means to be an owner, but what it means to be white, what it means to have privilege. And privilege becomes associated with whiteness. I am white, therefore I learned how to read and write. I am white, therefore I can no longer play with black children because it's not acceptable. And it's corrupting. It's corrupting. You have some games that are played by black and white children where the black children are always forced to be the slave, and the white child plays the auction master or the auctioneer, and they play at whipping where the white child can whip the black. It teaches them privilege. It teaches them mastery, or how to be masterful, and how to be rulers and how to rule. Teaches the black children that they're inferior. The separation at the time of schooling teaches black children that they are inferior to white children, that they are slaves, and it teaches them in a way their place. The community, the slave community, what we loosely call the community, is really a community of families or a community of kinship networks. And slaves were very adaptive, and sometimes we talk about the development of these kinship networks as an adaptive strategy. One way to make the system less brutal, one way to make the slavery less oppressive, was to develop these networks whereby you could get support from people who either were your blood kin or were not your blood kin. Family becomes increasingly more sacred the more it's threatened, so that even when people are separated from each other, when husband and wife are separated, when children are separated, within a particular plantation, people they respond automatically. They know how to stand in. Other women frequently stood in for the loss of a spouse so that they would help a woman along. A child that was left without a parent, there was always going to be someone who was going to take care of that child, either a mother's friend or someone who the child had come to know as Aunt so-and-so. Interestingly enough, even during the colonial period, we find that children, particularly girls are more likely to be kept with their mothers, and they're more likely to be kept with their grandmothers. And you get a kind of a matrilineal or matrifocal emphasis in this, because men are far more tangential to the system than are girls and mothers. Men are liable to be sold off. They are valuable for the work, and particularly the heavy labor that they can do. And girls are, for mothers in particular, girls are a source of joy and happiness, because quite frankly, one of the things that planners depended on was that a girl child would stay with her mother and take care of that mother in old age. Masters didn't do that. They often left their older slaves to die. Older slaves needed kin by them. They needed to have some sort of family, and usually it was a daughter or a granddaughter who served that role. One of the things that happened, and particularly again during the colonial period, because you couldn't, oftentimes you had what we call abroad marriages, and that would be where one slave lived on one plantation and the other lived on another, and they would be married. But it was usually the male slave who walked to see the female slave. And oftentimes a period of a week could go by, 2 weeks could go by. It all depended on the kind of arrangement that the masters had made between each other. But clearly, these were meetings that were worth waiting for, that had a lot more meaning because they had been separated for so long. I think the significance of the patriarchal structure is that white men become masters of both women and blacks. And in fact, they believe women and blacks to be inferior to them. And the laws are structured so that they have authority and they have will over everyone. I think a good way to look at the ways that slavery permeated white life is by imagining black people as sort of enablers for white people. If instead of going off to war, sometimes one could send a substitute. So one was a white male was helped and was enabled by a black person filling in for them. Black people enabled white people to simply differentiate among themselves as well, as long as black people were going to do all of the demeaning work, as long as all of the hard, back-breaking labor was was something that was assigned to black people, then one thing that white people could be assured of is that they would never fall so low as to be a slave, as to do the demeaning and the terrible labor that black people had to do. Black women enabled white women to be ladies. The leisure that white women gained, the leisure that they had to pay attention to their children, they had that leisure because black women were taking care of their children. Black women were doing the cooking. Black women were doing the washing. So black women enabled white motherhood in a way that certainly white women didn't enable black women. Black women allowed white women to be ladies in the sense that they could be feminine. They didn't have to. They were thought to be weak. They were thought to be delicate and frail. Why? Because so much of the labor that required them to be something other than that was done by black women, and similarly for black and white men. The fact that black men were disallowed from carrying guns, and guns in a period when they were likely to be and could be attacked by Indians, it allowed white men to define what manhood meant. They could carry guns. They were the ones who could vote. They could talk politics. And they did this, and they had the time to do this because the men, black men, were doing so much of the heavy labor. And because black men, in fact, were just simply disallowed from doing that. Even though only a very few white people owned slaves, most white people were somehow connected with slavery. So they were connected through the patrol system, whereby you had white men who were sort of paramilitary force who patrolled the woods and the roads at night. You had white men who were overseers of the system, who did the day-to-day running of the plantation. You had people who ran southern mills. Somehow these people were associated with slavery. One thing was sure, every white person could have status because they were not going to be black, because they were not going to be slaves. And among themselves, yes, there was differentiation. The planters, they could look at their black and white family and they could perceive everyone to be part of their families because in many ways they were the rulers of that system that gave everybody a job, that put everyone to work. So the Southern culture and the Southern economics is organized around the system of slavery. I think it's very hard for a child to be whole, for a black child to be whole. And I think we still don't know, we're still not aware of all of the devastation that slavery brought on children. But it was important that parents taught them first of all, taught them how to hide the slave community and the feelings of the slave community from white folks. Taught them how to be quiet and when to be quiet, when to speak and when not to speak, what information could be divulged and what information had to be kept quiet. It's hard to raise a child in slavery because a child sees daily the whippings, the brutality of the system, sees their parents coming under the authority, coming under the rule of the whip of the overseer even. So it's very difficult. But at the same time, I think parents teach children what is to be cherished about the slave community, and that's family, that's religion, and that's togetherness. The Revolutionary period is distinguished because during this period, even though it wasn't designed such, during this period, more black people become free than at any other period in the history of slavery in this country. It is during the Revolution, because of the chaos of the war, that more slaves were able to free themselves by simply running away. It is also during the Revolution that more slaves are manumitted. It is during and shortly after the Revolution that the North abolishes slavery, or at least begins those systems of gradual emancipation that makes the entire black population, even though it's not a very large population, it's still a very significant number of African Americans becoming free. And as a result of this freedom, you have your true freedom fighters now out of slavery, because the abolitionist movement does begin with the free black population. The problem with the libertarian ideology of the entire revolutionary and constitutional period is this notion that the pursuit of happiness is tied to property. So even though Thomas Jefferson is able to say all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, these rights include the right of property. And inasmuch as slaves are defined as property, it means that there is going to be a struggle, and a struggle to the death, to wrench this kind of property away from owners. So when, as you move out of this period and towards the Civil War, the notion of this is my property, or the idea that property cannot be taken from me, includes that of human beings. So as strongly as people might adhere to the notion of liberty and freedom, they adhere just as strongly to the notion of personal rights and property. So that is going to spell disaster for the African American, for the slave. I think a first generation African American, this generation won't know Africa in the same way that their parents knew Africa. Africa will be a place that is brought to him or her through stories, through tales maybe. But it also won't know, the child also won't know freedom in the same way that a parent knew freedom. If it's a girl child, what a parent can look forward to is probably a lot of grief in considering that the woman, or as the child grows into a woman, she will be pursued, she will perhaps be sexually exploited in ways that an African woman would not ever know that kind of sexual exploitation. There would be no laws that would protect these an African American child, whereas an African child is born into traditions, born into culture, brought into a society governed by rules and laws, and yet in the slave population there was nothing that was constant. Everything was going to be unpredictable. With Africa, things were predictable. And perhaps that was probably the one of the worst things about slavery, is not knowing whether or not you'd be able to live with this child, stay with this child, raise this child. And particularly for the first generation, since more than likely the parents had the child very shortly after they arrived. They may be here only 2 or 3 years if they're adults. For them, they probably had no idea. Well, slave marriages were not. They weren't legally performed. They had no legal foundation. So what a slave marriage was a commitment between a man and a woman to be faithful to each other, to love each other, to help each other. As far as the courts were concerned, as far as the churches were concerned, these marriages were not binding, and they couldn't be, or at least the slave system could not allow them to be, because if they were, then they would have to be broken with impunity whenever a slave master decided that, for one reason or another, he had to sell one or other of the slave couple. But I think as far as marriage is concerned, from the slave's perspective, it was part of the formation of family. It was part of the formation of those kinship networks, which was a form of survival, and which allowed them to exist under the slave system with some sort of dignity, with some sort of identity that was not that of a slave. Idealistically, we like to think that, that all of these marriages worked out and that everybody got along and that men and women loved each other and that there was no violence within the marriage, that support and love was the foundation, and every marriage ended, if it didn't end by sale or by death, that they endured. In fact, we know that slave marriages were not as stable as we would like them to have been. There were just so many things that imperiled the slave husband and wife. For one, it hurt slave men in particular to see their women abused, sexually abused, to see them whipped. And many a man said, I would rather not marry. I'd rather not even be on the plantation and have a wife if I cannot protect this wife, if I can't take care of my children. So those marriages that did endure had to be really strong, and those that endured were in fact strong, because this was something that men had to watch. And in some cases, they had to bear the fact that the white slave master was abusing his wife. And similarly, it was very hard for a woman to stand by and watch her husband be abused, and know that his masculinity was being threatened, and was in fact threatened. So it was very difficult, and particularly for women who knew that men were likely to be separated from them, because men were much more likely to be sold. And sons were likely to be sold than were women. Well, to be sure, lots of women found themselves in a situation where they were raising children with the help of other women, and not with the men who were the fathers of their children. We know that men ran away far more frequently than women, and one of the reasons that women don't run away as frequently has to do with children. Either they are pregnant with a child, or they have a child that's nursing, or the child is too small to run with them, and it's hazardous to run with a child. And women who tried to run away and who undertook the task, they were 3 times more likely to be caught. So very frequently, the person who was able to run was a man, because he was not going to get pregnant, and he wasn't. He didn't have the care of the child, and it's not that doesn't say that he didn't love his child, and that he didn't care deeply about the child, but it meant that he was not responsible for the feeding of the child, and children were nursed sometimes up until the time they were 3 years old. And then very frequently, right after ending nursing, women got pregnant again. So many of the women who do run away are middle-aged women, women who were done with their childbearing. In this case, I think that it is likely that Venture Smith decided that his sons could probably be instrumental in helping him raise money to buy his wife and his daughter out of slavery, because the boys could do heavy labor. He could, they were more likely to be money earners than were the daughters, and the daughters could get work as seamstresses, or the women could get work as seamstresses, as domestics. But as far as being wage earners, this would be very difficult for the women as opposed to the men. Domestic work during this time is not anything like it is today. Domestic labor entailed, let's just take cooking, for instance. That meant that one had to cut wood, bring wood in, tote wood, as they might say, usually build a fire indoors. Meals are made from scratch, and so one would have to go to a garden, get the food. If there was water to be brought in the house, that had to be brought from a river or a stream or some other source. Everything was made in the home, from soap that's made with lye to butter that is whipped and churned. So very few things are store-bought during this time. So domestic labor is incredible. It's just incredibly time-consuming, and it's also very hard and back-breaking labor. I think it's important to really differentiate the 17th and 18th century from the 19th century. When most people look back on slavery, they see big plantations, and they think about cotton. And I think one thing that's very important is that cotton is a 19th century phenomenon. And during the 17th and 18th century, the cash crops that we're talking about are tobacco, and we're talking about hemp and indigo and rice. All of which were very important in establishing the economic stability of the colonies, but none of which took on the kind of the implications of cotton, because cotton was a cash crop that fueled the Industrial Revolution of England, of Europe, and even of the United States. And yet, during this period, there's a fluidity during this period that you just don't have during the 19th century. The frontier is expanding. There's still a lot of negotiating that has to be done with Native Americans. It's not clear that America is going to settle all the way even to the Mississippi River, so that there are lots of questions, and this is a time when some reversals could have been made. I think it is in 1793 when Eli Whitney discovers the cotton gin, and when cotton becomes king, it really seals the fate of African Americans, and really slavery really then clamps down on the race. America in the 17th and 18th century is a land where you have Africans, you have Europeans, you have Native Americans, and they're really coming together to form an American culture, an American people. And each group is identifying itself against the others. And each is borrowing from each other's culture, whether it's from food, or whether it's music, or whether it's just simply a way of seeing the world. So an American at 1750 is some sort of composite of all three groups, of all three cultures. And although Europeans would like to think that it was just that the Native American and the African didn't influence their heritage, or didn't influence the way that they looked at life, in fact they did. Frances Kimball's journal is probably one of the few accounts. It's a traveler's account. It combines a lot of things. It's a traveler's account. She's a person who comes from another country. She's got a very sensitive ear. She's looking at slavery not as an American, but really as a foreigner. And she hasn't really lived here in the United States. And so everything is new to her. And the oppression that she feels, the heat that she feels, she gives you a sense of the South that I think others, at least those people who lived in the time in the South, took for granted. Just took it for granted. She is someone who hasn't lived with the kind of oppression. She hasn't lived with Africans. She hasn't lived with African Americans. She is surprised by everything she sees. Everything is new to her. And so you get a view of women's lives. You get a perspective of a woman as well, and a woman who is not deeply involved in the system as the system is unfolding before her. So she's an observer of it. And she's one of the few people who talks about women, who talks about the lives of African American women. And she's sensitive to it. And even though maybe some people think that the journal, she makes a whole lot of things up, for a person coming to the United States in the middle of the 19th century, everything to her, as I said before, was new, and a lot of things were painful. It was very painful for her to see the system unfold, as well as to see her husband so involved in it, because her husband is a plantation holder. He's a very large plantation holder, and she is somebody who we need to listen to. We just need to hear her voice, because if she wanted to, she could certainly protect her husband by covering up a lot of this. But everything is so stark, and everything is just right out there. And she's somebody who is recording it at the time that it's happening. The black women on the plantation that she's on, one of the things that I think, in fact, the most important thing about the journal is that she reveals, quite unknowingly, the centrality of motherhood, the centrality of childbirth, and the importance of women to the whole institution of slavery. And also the fact that black women know this. They know that they are responsible for reproducing the slave population. That if that the system really rests on their backs and in their wombs. The fact is that they come to her and they say, though we know able to work, we make little niggas for massa, which says a lot. Number one, these women, as ignorant as they are kept, know that the system relies on them, knows that that their value is not only the work that they do, but the children that they have. And the fact is, on this plantation, as on every other plantation in the South, masters depended on women to reproduce the slave population. The foreign slave trade ends in 1808, and as a result of that, the reproduction of the system, the whole labor system, is dependent on African American women to have children for the system, so that you have little boys and little girls, and they grow up into slaves. And women are also responsible for socializing these children, for socializing them into slavery. And I think, Bremer's, I got that wrong. Kimball's diary, or her journal, tells us this, that women are they're almost like on a conveyor belt through the system. They have children, they go back out to the fields. 2.5 years later, they're pregnant again, they have children, they go back out to the fields and work. So that at no time are women free from labor. The other thing I think she reveals is just how much work slave masters can get out of their women. Even when they're supposedly doing light work, they're doing light hoeing, if there's such a thing as light hoeing. They're weaving, they're sewing, they're making soap. They're looking after the babies of the plantation. Kimball's diary, I think, shows us just how circumscribed women's lives were, and just how centered they were around having babies and taking care of babies. Yes, if you read your newspapers, DuBose review, lots of journals, and Southerners wrote extensively on the subject of how to treat women to make sure that they gave birth naturally, that they had as many children as they possibly could have. One slave woman described her mother as a regular man woman. And she said, my mother could do anything. She could hunt, she could trap, she could pick cotton all day. And then she also had children. So she could do everything a man could do and everything a woman could do and more. So women were expected to do all of those things. They were expected to have the babies. They were expected to work in the fields. You could find women working, repairing fences. If you're in the lumber region of Alabama, they would be found carting logs in leather carriers on their backs. They could plow, and they did plow using mule teams. In the rice districts, they were found, with their skirts reefed up around their waist, working in water up to their waist. On the other hand, African American women, slave women, had a kind of double duty, because when they returned from the fields, when they returned from their outdoor labor, they also they had to set to work of cooking. They had to spin cloth, or spin and weave and sew. They had to do the laundry. They had, sometimes they were given Saturdays, afternoons off to do their laundry, as well as to do the laundry of single men on the plantation. So it was nothing that a woman wasn't expected to do. Into the system, there is built a whole system of rewards for women who have a lot of children, who have them frequently. Women are sometimes given all day on Saturday, all day free from working, if they have 6 children. Sometimes they're given an extra dress if they're prolific. Sometimes a quarter even. There's a whole system. It's a rather insidious system, which is a system of breeding, and it's not like they would force a man and woman together, but they'd make it possible in every way possible. They make it possible for them to have a child, and they would reward women for having a child. In fact, one Virginia slave master went so far as to tell his slave that if she had a child for every one of his 5 children, he would set her free. It took her 11 years, but in 11 years, after she gave birth to her 5th child, he did in fact set her free. Well, certainly for slave women to have children, they knew all the time that when they gave birth, that this child could be taken away from them at any time. Sometimes as an infant, usually not during infancy, since slave masters wanted slave women to nurse the children and take care of them. But certainly, and particularly, they knew if the child was a male child, because men and boys, and particularly adolescents, tended to be separated from mothers and fathers much more so and much more often than were girls. But on the other hand, I remember a slave woman who's saying that she looked at her child and she says, my child, him is mine. And no matter what slaveholders wanted to do and what they managed to do, one of the things that this child gave this particular woman, as I think children gave to all slave women, was a point of reference that was different from the masters. Was a way of being, a sense of being that was totally outside the master's control. True, slave children didn't belong to the slave mother, to the slave father. Didn't belong to them legally, but spiritually, they said all the time, these children are mine, and they knew it. And they did everything they could to keep that bond sacred. Well, if the slave master could have had his way, slaves would have only done one thing, and that was work. And for women, they would work in the fields and then reproduce at home. But what the family does, and what the family did for African Americans, was create a world outside of the world of work. It allowed for significant others. It allowed a male slave to be more than just a brute beast. It allowed him to be a father, to be a son. It allowed women to be mothers and to take on roles that was outside of that of a slave, of a servant. And in that way, even though on the one hand, you see, the slave master wanted this family because he wanted the slaves to reproduce and to do it in a rather natural way. But in allowing for that, they allowed for a whole world to develop because out of families came communities, and with communities came a world that the slave master hardly ever knew, didn't know, and didn't venture into. Oh, for sure. For sure, and they do every single thing that they can. It's to maintain these communities. It is sacred because these are people who one eats with, one worships with, one commiserates with. They are people to whom one can take one's sorrow to. They are people who take care when slave masters whip. These are people who will soothe and administer. It's from the slave community, and particularly from the women of the community, that most of the health care has comes from. Women working as nurses, and some healers. I mean, preachers are healers. The women are nurses. So the community was where the slave master interrupted and oppressed. The community soothed and helped. Well, Harriet Jacobs is a slave. She is raised on a plantation. She lives with her grandmother. When she reaches, I think she's in her teenage years, her master begins to pursue her. And I mean, her fate was that which was suffered by many slave women. And the master pursued her, and her mistress showed absolutely no sympathy for her whatsoever. In fact, her mistress had a kind of jealous hatred of her. When she has children, she, like other slave women, had to think about, well, what's going to happen to them? How will they be raised? And she, when her second child is born, she finds that the child is a girl, and she says, my poor child, she will have miseries superadded to the burdens of all slaves. Hers is worse because she's a girl. Slave women had to deal with sexual exploitation, pure, unadulterated rape. They had to deal with, they had no one to protect them. Unfortunately, slave men, their brothers, their husbands, their fathers, couldn't protect them. So it was only by the force of their own arms that they could fight off an attacker, whether that was a male slave or whether it was a white master. They pretty much stood alone in the face of this kind of harassment, the kind of sexual exploitation. And in the South, there was no recognition of rape for black women. In other words, the rape of a black woman was not considered to be a crime. And in fact, this matter came up in court cases, and judge after judge said, we do not find the rape of a black woman to be a crime in this society. So black women could be raped, could be exploited sexually, and they were with impunity. Harriet Jacobs decides she's going to go into hiding when she hears that her children are about to be sold. They're about to be sold and broken in. Now, Harriet Jacobs had children, but her children were half white. She had children with a white man. He had tried to buy the children, and her master, Dr. Flint, would not allow it. He had a rather perverse desire for Harriet Jacobs and for her children. I mean, they were his, and he wanted them to remain his. And in fact, what he decides to do is to make sure that that he has a hold on Harriet as well as her children, is to separate them and send them, as he calls it, to be broken. And by that, set them to doing very, very hard work. Set them out into the fields. And if they disobeyed, if they couldn't keep up, whip them. And Harriet says, she wanted something better for her children. And I think she, just like so many other slave women, those slave women who we know did run away, many of them, if not most, ran away in order to protect their children. When Harriet Jacobs decides to run away, her grandmother is really very apprehensive, because to make that decision, it's a desperate decision. And you could, as well as many did, be brought back to be whipped. You could be killed. You could be set upon by dogs. So to make that decision in the beginning is a really desperate decision. And she runs away, and she hides in an attic, and she hides there for what turns out to be about 7 years. And it is through the attic window that she's able to see the comings and goings of people in her community. She sees her children, she sees Dr. Flint. But when she goes, her grandmother wants her to stay, doesn't want her to leave. And she says, Lord's child, stand by your children, because a woman who does not stand by and protect their children will never be respected. She gets help from a friend who doesn't have any children. Her name is Betty. And she says, those children will kill you dead. You better leave them. Run. Her grandmother's admonition is always in her ear, and that's like, stand by your children until death. No one respects a woman, a mother, who does not stand by their children. So she's torn. Well, when she goes into hiding, she goes into an attic, and from there, she looks at her children, and she's able to do this because she drills this hole with a gimlet or a hand drill. It's very tiny, but she's able to still see her children. She's able to see the comings and goings of people that she knows, and she watches for up to 7 years the comings and goings of people in her community, in her town. And especially agonizing for her was to see her children coming and going. And they don't know where their mother is or what has happened to their mother. All they know is that she's not there. And that is a particular dilemma that not only Harriet Jacobs experienced, but one that gave many women pause. Because here it is, they have to decide, do I leave? Do I run? What will happen to my children? In Harriet Jacobs' case, she's afraid of them being sold away or being taken to a plantation to be broken in. So what does she do? She is being pursued by her master who wants to have sex with her and who is going to exploit her in the worst possible way. But she's not able to just think about herself. She has to think about her children and what's going to happen to them without their mother. The father, Mr. Sands, who is a white man, he had wanted to buy them. He had wanted to take care of them, but was not able to because Dr. Flint just disallowed it, wouldn't sell the children. So her dilemma is it's a terrible dilemma. And as it turns out, her children eventually are taken north by some of her friends, and she meets them up north later on. Well, in fact, yes, she is able to stay there from help. She gets help from her community, from friends, many of whom are free blacks. Free blacks were the bane of white folks' existence. They were feared simply because they were black and they were free, and they were natural abolitionists. they knew that they were just one step, as well as most of them were, one step out of slavery, one step away from slavery. They felt a kindred with their slave brothers and sisters, and they were always there to help, and in fact did help all the time. In fact, you have the emergence around 1815 of many colonization societies, and these colonization societies were created by whites not to colonize slaves in Liberia and in Africa, but to rid Southern society of free blacks, because they were afraid of them. They were afraid of the help that they gave the slaves. They were also afraid that these were the people who would lead the revolts against slavery. That Dr. Flint pursues her, I think, is evidence of a lot of things. White men ruled the South. Theirs was a patriarchal regime. There was nothing that existed that they could not have or that they could not buy. The laws of property were written to favor them, not to favor white women, but to favor white men. Linda Brent, or Harriet Jacobs, was his property, and he believed that he had rights to her, he had access to her, and they were his rights. I think it speaks, his pursuit of her speaks to the patriarchal power of the South. And one particular incident that happens that Kimball talks about has to do with Frank, who is the overseer, or he's a driver, and Betty, his wife. And yes, the overseer rapes his wife, and she has a son with the overseer. Many men on Southern plantations, many slave men had to endure this. And for that reason, many slave men refused to marry. When someone like William Wells Brown said that he would just not marry because he did not want to have his wife whipped, he did not want her subjected to rape, and he have to stand there and watch and be just totally incapable of doing anything. Many men risk life and limb to support or to in defense of their wives. But in this case, with Frank being the driver, one would suspect, especially since the driver is a very central person on plantations. As a black man, he is the most respected man. He has the most authority of any black man on that plantation. And for him to have had to see his wife and to have to endure this, it says a lot about plantation. No, there was no escape, no matter how high up, quote unquote, one got in the system, even if you were a driver. And on the Butler plantation, sometimes there was an absentee owner most of the time, because the owner could not be there. It was a malaria-infested area. And in the summer months of July and August, there was never a white man on that plantation. So often the overseer wasn't even there. So all of the authority, all of the power was vested in this driver. And even he was subjected to this kind of humiliation. And the fact that his wife, if his wife could be taken and abused this way, then no man's wife was safe, and no man could protect his wife. Yes, if this driver, if Frank cannot protect Betty, and he has all of the authority, I mean, if Frank can't protect his wife, his wife Betty, and Frank is a driver, and he has the most authority of any black man on that plantation, what that says is that no woman could ever get protection from any man, from any black man on that plantation. No man could protect his wife, and no woman could seek protection or get it. Well, in defining who a slave was, what a slave could and could not do, white people, Southerners, but also Northerners as well, Americans in general, defined what it meant to be free. because the slave was the opposite of a free person. So if a slave was a person who worked and who was expected to do all of the work, who was expected to do all of the heavy labor, then a free person, a white person, was somebody who was not expected to work, who wasn't expected to work from sunup to sundown. If a free person could be owned or could be an owner, then the slave person was a person who was owned. In the very early years when the system is being established, white came to mean Christian. It came eventually, Englishman meant Christian, it meant white. African got associated with black, got associated with heathenism, got associated with savagery. And in the process of this, as the centuries went by, black people were defined by white people as white people decided on who they were. Whiteness got defined at the same time as slavery was established. Whiteness meant someone who was free, someone, it came to mean someone who could vote, because the slaves certainly could not vote. Blackness meant not to be able to be owned, also not to own property. If one was defined as property, then white people came to be the owners of that property. Well, in defining the slave, I think white people define themselves. If a slave was somebody who was black, who did all the work, who served in perpetuity, then the opposite of that was somebody who was white, who was free, who did not work, or at least did not work as hard. If the slave had to answer to a white man, to a higher authority, if the slave had a master, if that's what it meant to be a slave, if that's what it meant to be black, then to be white meant that you answered only to yourself. It meant that not only didn't you do any work, but that you could own property. Slaves can't own property. Slaves are property. The reverse of that, or the opposite side of that, is that to be white meant to be able to own property. If slaves can't serve on juries, if slaves can't testify in court, and if that's the meaning of slavery, and if slavery is racial and it's black, then to be white meant that, yes, you had the right not only to vote, but to serve on jury, to testify. Your freedom gets defined in opposition to the black man's slavery. Well, their reality is being shaped, particularly in the 1820s and the 1830s. Their reality is being shaped by the development of the manufacturing and industrial sector. And one of the things that they have to worry about, particularly white men, is whether or not, as wage slaves, they will fall into slavery themselves. When they call themselves wage slaves, what do they mean? They are developing an identity as a worker in the context of slavery, where people, in fact, are slaves. They could say euphemistically, we're tied to the machine. They could say euphemistically that we're wage servants, that we're white slaves, that we are wage slaves. But they are developing a consciousness in a period when, in fact, slavery does, in fact, exist. So how are they different? They have got to decide, how am I different? Am I free to own property? Most white men are free to own property, but they can't because they don't make enough money. But I'm working, and I'm working in the ways that I'm working. I'm working like a slave, but there really is slavery. And slaves, in fact, black people do lose their freedom. Does that mean that the worker will somehow slip beneath that line and somehow become a slave, a real slave? They define what it means to be a worker and what it means to be a white worker in the context of black slavery. There is a fear that they will lose their freedom. White workers do fear very much so that they will lose their freedom. And in fact, it is that fear of loss of freedom that forces them to differentiate themselves from the slave. And in differentiating themselves from the slave, they must differentiate themselves from the black man, from the black person. They have to gain an identity as a white worker, that one that is very different from what it means to be a black worker in American society in the antebellum South. American freedom exists above the color line. And I think it is that color line, that line that differentiates between white and black, that makes it possible for there to be freedom among white people, for there to be such a thing as upward mobility. No one would ever fall below the line. No white person is ever going to fall below that line that demarks freedom and slavery. They can never be slaves, and as a result, they can never perhaps be wage slaves. They can always somehow have opportunity. It is the black man who is doing the hardest, the heaviest, the most demeaning labor that makes it possible for white people to believe that they will never have to do that. It makes American freedom possible, that makes mobility and equal opportunity for whites possible. It is freedom that exists above the color line. And so in American society, unlike most European societies, class becomes demarcated not so much along socioeconomic levels, how much do you make, but class really gets differentiated along lines of color, blacks versus whites. As long as you were white, then you could never be black. As long as you were white, you could never be a slave. And as long as you were white, you could never do the most demeaning, the most horrible work. You could never be exploited like a slave. That was what black people did. For sure, the blueprint is laid down by slavery. One of the interesting issues surrounding the whole development of slavery is whether or not slavery caused prejudice or prejudice caused slavery. And in fact, they probably fed on each other. The fact of the matter is, though, that by the time of the American Revolution, when American principles of freedom and liberty are set down, by that time, black has come to mean demeaning labor. Black has come to have all these negative connotations. And black has become associated with slavery. And slavery is the opposite of freedom. And even after slavery is once emancipation comes with, at the end of the Civil War, even after slavery is done away with, the fact that black people have been associated with this and got defined in such a way that made it possible for black people to be the laborers of this country, it was going to be almost impossible for that label to just disappear, because color became such a defining line in this country by the time of emancipation. Slavery in this country was not just slavery; it was racial slavery, and for sure it was not just about economics. It was pure and simple about color. What certain people could do and what certain people could not do based on the color of their skins. You couldn't get rid of the color of black people's skin, so you couldn't get rid of the prejudice and the associations that went along with the color and with blackness. Very early on, from Thomas Jefferson, from Benjamin Franklin, there were feelings that black people were different, were fundamentally different. I mean, at one point, black people were thought to be a different species. But black people were fundamentally different. And when in Jefferson's Notes on Virginia and in letters that Benjamin Franklin wrote, they had a preference, and they put it right out there. And their preference was for white people. They thought white people were prettier, they were more beautiful, they were more intellectual, they were deserving of freedom. So by the time you get to emancipation, people who have been thought to be deserving of slavery, deserving of demeaning treatment, that does not go away with the institution. And that's because the prejudice that went along with slavery, the prejudice that made slavery, that was essential for slavery's perpetuation, just didn't disappear. I think we get a very good look at women's networks in the Butler Islands, and even though Kimball is describing this women's network, she really doesn't know that she's describing it. The women are all in the infirmary. The infirmary was a woman's world, because most of the women who were there are they're either just about to have a child or just finished having a child. They're either nursing a child. It's a perfect example of how women take care of each other. When a woman is in labor, it's African American women who are taking care of them. Midwives are black. The people who African women, who these women in particular look to for support during their laying in time, they're African American women. They're slaves. The female network, I think, it functioned almost like a family in the sense that women could get support from each other if they needed some sort of advice about men. They would go to their women friends. It was also a point of reference as far as beauty was concerned. Women would tell each other, how to wear, how to carry themselves. The women's network socialized young girls into the community of women, how to carry oneself when one was working a little bit too fast, when one had to slow down. There were leaders in this community, people and women who other women could look to for support, but also as a point of pride and with a source of pride. Women who were nurses, for instance, were really looked up to. Older women who knew the secrets of roots and who very often had childcare responsibilities. They were the mothers when the real mothers were out in the fields working. So women had to rely on themselves. It's often said that slave women and African American women in particular are self-reliant and self-sufficient. But it was a self-sufficiency and a self-reliance that didn't come naturally, and it was a self-reliance and self-sufficiency that was built on dependence on other women. The Butler Island was located in an area where there were very few white people. It was malaria infested. It was infested with yellow fever, and during July, August, September, and even maybe parts of June, you found that most of the white planters who owned the plantation there, they tended to leave the island. They tended to go north, or they went onto the mainland because it was just too dangerous for them to be around. And as a result, it led to a population that was very African because there were very few whites there. They were also very dark-skinned because there was, at least for the women in these islands, a lot less sexual exploitation than there was on the mainland because there were so few white men there. Few white men, few white women. And as a result, it is in the Sea Islands that you find a lot of the most African culture that you find in the United States is preserved there. So a lot of religious practices are maintained. respect for the elderly is most maintained there. You'll find African music patterns there that you don't find. And most of all, you find the language is very different. We call it Gullah language. And it's a pidgin English, but it is almost more African than it is English. And in fact, it is probably made up, it's a language that comprises more African languages than it does English. Marx once said that religion is the opiate of the masses, but it didn't really function that way for African Americans. African Americans during the slavery period took the Old Testament in particular as their Bible. And in the Old Testament, God set his chosen people free. And God delivered Moses and he delivered the Israelites out of bondage. And those passages that talked about freedom and freedom from misery and freedom from labor are those passages that are most important to slaves. Christianity also gave African Americans a higher authority. It wasn't slaves obey your master. Well, who's the master? The master is God, the God that's in heaven. Christianity taught a certain equality, a brotherhood. All men are equal because all men are the children of God, and therefore all men are equal in his sight. If white people who taught slaves to read sometimes were prosecuted, they were sometimes fined, they were sometimes put in jail. It was a crime to teach a slave to read. And yet, some masters had to allow certain slaves to learn how to read because, like the driver who ran the plantations, there are many slaves that have a lot of authority and who planters, they need them to be able to read in order for them to carry on the business of the plantation. But in fact, it was very dangerous for any white person to teach a slave to read. It was even more dangerous because with that knowledge, one could write a pass to write themselves a pass so that that would make it easier for them to run away. They were always able to tell what white people were doing and thinking, and then they could also learn about rebellions in other places, about what black people, what slaves were doing in other places, and then in that regard, they were never cut off and as cut off from each other as whites would have wanted them to be. Rape and sexual exploitation are not just incidental to the system, but they're really essential because the way that you oppress a people, and particularly you oppress the men, is by making it impossible for them to protect their women. That way you can keep the whole race down. You can subject them all. Well, I think one of the things that people did to protect themselves psychologically was to create relationships with each other, was to create relationships within the slave community. By having a wife, by being a father, by being a mother, you created some space. You created a whole new identity, an identity that existed outside that which was imposed by the slave master. The other thing, you had kinship networks, and you made fictive kinship networks, even among people who were not your real brother or sister. You treated them that way. And in that way, you created bonds where there might not be any otherwise, particularly if you'd been sold away, if you'd been sold down the river and put on a plantation somewhere where you had no mother, where you had no father. Very quickly, I mean, what happened was that people made brothers out of men and boys who were there, made sisters out of the women who were there. They formed relationships. They formed human relationships. Religion also helped people protect themselves psychologically. The fear of being sold was always there. I think it was probably there even when they weren't thinking about it, because so much of the behavior that you see with slaves has to do with keeping the family intact, staying on a particular plantation. As Kimball brought out, women would have children sometimes. They would have children just to show the master, yes, I can have babies. I can be a good slave if that's what you want me to do. And in this way, anchor themselves to a particular plantation. But the fear of being sold was just horrific. It penetrated everything that the slave did. I don't think you can understand race relations today without understanding slavery. Until we come to grips with it, until we understand people's prejudices, their origins, we really can't even begin to work on getting rid of them and working together as a people. Even though people will say, well, I didn't do it. White people will say, I didn't do it. My father didn't do it. Even my grandparents, they didn't do it. One of the things that's essential is to know that slavery is not just a Southern institution. It's an American institution. And it was an institution that everyone bought into. The North bought into it. The South bought into it. It was cotton that made this country king in 1850 and 1860. It was cotton that fueled the early industrial revolution in this country, particularly in New England. So without understanding the past, we really can't understand the future. We can't understand why people have the prejudices they have, how black people and white people came to be at opposite ends and on certain issues like civil rights, human rights. I think the impact that sexual violence has on white families is twofold. At the same time that it just, first of all, it destroys relationships between white men and women. It makes them distrustful of each other because white women can never really have faith in the men who are bringing black women into their homes and raping them and exploiting them. But at the same time, it teaches white men that there is nothing that they can't have. It strengthens the whole patriarchal system that Southern society is based on. They can have black women, they can have white women. There is nothing that isn't theirs. I think that the violence that we see in the South is perpetuated for just this reason, that a man, he can't be brought to justice. There is nothing that isn't his.